A new analysis finds the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion has delivered huge benefits in its first year of operation. Plus, laying out a path for privatization is a time to sell off Canada Post. All that and more straight ahead on episode 22 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Hey folks, thanks for joining us here on the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us. Plenty of ground to cover on this episode of the show, so let's get right into it. Amid all sorts of questions about future pipeline projects in Canada, we recently marked the one-year anniversary of a major milestone, the official completion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. That, as I'm sure we all recall, was an enormously challenging project to get over the finish line, both in terms of overcoming opposition and ensuring the proper consultation was done, but also the escalating cost of finishing the expansion once the federal government took over the project. But now that we've had a full year of this pipeline in operation, we have a much clearer picture of why it was so important to complete the Trans Mountain expansion in the first place. A new analysis from Alberta Central finds the pipeline has already delivered a substantial financial and economic impact to both Alberta and to Canada as a whole. Joining us for more on the conclusions and implications from this report is Charles St-Arnaud. He's chief economist at Alberta Central, albertacentral.com for more. Charles, so great to have you with us here.
Thank you for having me.
So we're dealing with the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. I mean, it is a pipeline like we do have with other pipelines, but there's a lot that is unique about Trans Mountain. So how does that factor into any kind of economic analysis like this?
Yeah, well, I think the main impact of the Trans Mountain is, one, it increased our export capacity generally, but most importantly, it's improved our exporting capacity towards new markets. So especially that access to the Pacific coast is now opening up more the path for more oil to reach Asia and also the west coast of the U.S.
It is interesting, as the report notes, our exports to the U.S. have actually declined slightly, and I suppose absent the Trans Mountain Pipeline, that would be a serious challenge. But you look at the data, and it certainly shows that we're more than able now to overcome that.
Yeah, well, the Trans Mountain has shown, one, yes, exports to the U.S. have declined so far this year, but it's kind of marginal in terms of decline. But what we're seeing is the composition of where our exports to the U.S. are going. There's less exports going to the Midwest, the Gulf Coast, and the East Coast, but a lot more oil going to the West Coast. Actually, our exports to the West Coast are almost 33% higher this year than they were for the same period last year. So that's a big change. That's because now oil can be loaded in tankers or loaded on tankers or diverted to pipelines going to refineries in Washington State. So that helps a lot. But then also there's our access to market has also tripled. Pre-expansion of the TMX, we were exporting about 3% or 2% of our oil exports were going to non-US country. Now we're about at 9%. So it's a big jump.
Yeah, that certainly is. And let's talk about why that matters, because it's not just about, we get it out of the ground, put it in a pipeline, and it doesn't really matter where it ends up, because it does matter significantly. And this analysis looks at the impact of what's known as the price differential. So let's talk about why that is so important here.
Yeah, well, the issue that we've seen, and we've seen it since 2011 or so, like since the early 2010, is that as Canada's exports of oil continue to or increase rapidly, they were only being able to be funneled to one area, and it was the Midwest and the Midwest of the United States. And at some point, it becomes considered what I would call the oversupply. So you start to have it demands a much lower prices than other benchmarks. So that you started to see the Western Canada Select, which is kind of in some ways our benchmark for Canadian production, starting to be discounted relative to the West Texas Intermediate. And that means that our oil exports we get less revenues per barrel. So having the optionality of sending oil elsewhere removed that kind of phenomenon of oversupply that we've seen over the past almost 15 years. And we've seen that since the start of the TMX, the spread between WCS and WTI has narrowed by about $6 a barrel. Actually, it reached almost $15 a barrel last fall. So it has
Wow.
been so that's kind of a decent amount of extra revenues for the oil industry, just thanks to that better pricing. With the TMX, we've had kind of an increase of about 13 billion in terms of revenues from that better pricing. So that's about 10% increase compared to where if we didn't have the TMX. But that's equivalent to about a full month of production, of extra production for free without any extra cost for the industry.
Right, and that's just the first year. So I think that's really encouraging, especially in the context, I guess, of how difficult and expensive it was to build this project. Trans Mountain, the expansion did end up coming in with a pretty large price tag. So how do we look at now the benefits we're seeing versus the cost?
Well, the thing is that when we look at the benefit overall, it's clear that there's a positive benefit considering the 34 billion cost. So, and even though it could be a lot of disagreement there, it's clear in my view that it's been positive. The question is it worth for the person who foot the bill? Because it was mostly paid by the federal government, and the share of those revenues going to the government, to the federal government, are relatively small because they
Mhm.
only make about $2 billion back in terms of corporate taxes. But it's not the way government works. They don't just look at the pure financial benefits. They look at the broader benefits on the society, and they will be looking at the whole 13 billion and be like, okay, that's a very positive. One of the actor that's actually benefiting significantly from the TMX of expansion is actually the government of Alberta. A
Yeah.
quick estimate shows that the narrower spread is bringing about $4.4 billion in extra royalty revenues just in the first year, and another extra $1 billion in corporate taxes. So 5.4 billion in extra revenue is quite a significant amount.
Oh, definitely. Yes. And in terms of lifting Alberta's economy, you had an interesting analysis a few months ago looking at where we'd seen some decline and why maybe we're seeing some frustration or discontent in Alberta. To what extent maybe is the expansion and everything that goes along with TMX helping to lift Alberta's economy?
That's a more complex issue. And I've wrote a lot in the past few years on that, is that there's been a structural change in the way uh, those oil revenues are being used and how much of those revenues are actually staying in the economy, in the local economy in Alberta. And we've seen a change. For example, Canadian oil company are reinvesting a much smaller share of those revenues back into their operation. It used to be about 30% of their revenues in the mid 2010. Now it's about 10% or so, so a big significant decline.
Yeah.
And they're also returning a lot more of those revenues to their shareholders, either through dividend and share buyback. We were talking about 3% of revenues back in the mid 2010. Now it's almost 12% of revenue. So it's a big increase. But the subtlety there is that most of the ownership of the Canadian oil, of the big Canadian oil companies, so those who are public, are actually owned by foreigners. About 80% of the shareholders are non-Canadian. So that money that's returned to shareholders is not being returned to the Canadian economy. So that's one of the things that has changed too, is that we're making more revenue, but less of it is staying in the province and having that positive economic multiplier.
Well, it's interesting. Conversation right now, of course, is shifting toward maybe where the next big pipeline project is going to be and whether there's a need for one, what kind of benefit that might have, both in terms of the oil industry specifically, the economy more broadly. What does this tell us then about the potential impact of or the case for another major project?
Yeah. Well, I think it shows one that there's value in big projects. However, I think we need to be really cautious not to interpret that, oh, TMX has brought $13 billion. Doing a similar pipeline will bring us automatically another $13 billion. It's not the
Yeah.
way it works because the spread between WCS and WTI, so that oil price differential, is not going to narrow much further than where we are. Structurally, there should be about a $10 a barrel difference between the two because it's different grade of oil. WCS is heavy and sour, WTI is light and sweet. So WCS is more expensive to refine. So it has to be in some ways at a discount to compensate for that. I always make the analogy. It's like WCS is your regular gas at the pump and WTI is your premium. Wherever you do, there will always be a difference. So there will always be a slight discount on WCS. So, but reducing it more will be difficult. And it might be another $1, $2. It won't have the same impact in terms of revenues. However, what a new pipeline will bring is extra capacity to diversify our export to other markets. So allowing us to continue to have access to better pricing and also prevent the whole pipeline system to get clogged, and either preventing increase in production, or also if it's clogged towards the US, having again that price differential starting to widen again and reversing some of the benefits of TMX.
Right. So allowing for that increase in production or these sort of investments in economic activity that would entail, it would have those kinds of benefits.
Yes, it's really that. It allows continuous expansion in the oil production. The question is always how fast, how big, and how much do we need? But it's clear that having that optionality of market has been extremely beneficial, and having that access will allow to continue to have those benefits in the future.
Well, very interesting. So much more is mentioned, albertacentral.com. Charles, thank you so much for the overview and the insight. Appreciate you joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so once again, that is Charles St-Arnaud. He is chief economist at Alberta Central, albertacentral.com. You can read this analysis of the impact that the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion has had, and it has been considerable. So I think there's a lot to draw from that. As he says, it's not necessarily going to be the same experience if and when we build another major pipeline project, but as he says, there is still an economic case for Canada to do so. I guess the question is, will Canada do so? There is certainly a lot of pressure on the federal government to approve a new major pipeline project, much of that coming from Alberta's premier, certainly some of that coming from the opposition federally as well. On Thursday, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre at a press conference in Calgary announced plans to bring forward in the fall what they are calling the Canadian Sovereignty Act to try to accelerate plans to get some major new projects built. Now, a lot of this includes some of the things that the Conservatives have called for previously, like repealing Bill C-69 or C-48 or the oil and gas emissions cap, these kinds of liberal policies that have been identified both by the Conservatives and by Alberta's premier as obstacles to significant energy development and building new projects in Canada. Now, in the meantime, though, I think there's some decisions for the Prime Minister to make here. They've passed their Bill C-5, which is supposed to open the door to building major projects in Canada, which could possibly include a major new pipeline project or maybe a major new LNG project. And at the same time, of course, we're in this uncertain phase with regard to the United States and tariffs and trying to get some kind of new trade deal. So it's a little bit from what Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre had to say at his press conference Thursday, including here this announcement of the Canadian Sovereignty Act, which they will table coming up in the fall.
The reason we are here is to announce the Canadian Sovereignty Act and to make a call to action. A conservative government would have acted more quickly to protect the sovereignty of our country. Under the Liberal government, that sovereignty has been eroded by policies that block our development, tax our people, and make us uncompetitive. The Canadian Sovereignty Act would move us in the opposite direction. It seeks to legalize economic development, reward those who build, protect Canadian innovation, and get shovels in the ground on major nation-building projects between now and March the 14th, the one-year anniversary of Mark Carney taking office. The problem, of course, is that Donald Trump has imposed unjustified and unjustifiable tariffs on our economy and our people. Now, Mark Carney promised that he would handle Donald Trump. That's a quote. He said that he would negotiate a win with Donald Trump. He said that the deal would be done by July the 21st, and then he said it would be done by August the 1st. Those promises were not kept. The tariffs have actually doubled since Mark Carney became Prime Minister, promising that he would get results. The promises have not been kept, and meanwhile, Canada's economy gets weaker. The deficit is now bigger under Carney than it was under Trudeau. Inflation is rising. Home building is falling. Tens of billions of dollars of net investment have left Canada since he took office. Not a single major pipeline or natural gas facility, a new one, has been identified for approval by the Carney government, and we're going in the exact wrong direction. And that's why the Conservative proposal for a Sovereignty Act will take action immediately. In this fall, we will introduce a motion calling on the government to put forward this legislation. The Sovereignty Act will legalize pipeline and other major projects by repealing the anti-development law C-69. It will legalize shipping Canadian energy off the northwest coast of BC by repealing C-48. It will axe the industrial carbon tax, something the Europeans are doing, and given that our competitors in America have no industrial carbon tax, it is untenable to force our people and our industries to pay this tax. We will get rid of the oil and gas cap that kills jobs. We will get rid of the ban on plastics, the petrochemical industry that produces our plastics. The plastics themselves are essential, and so are the jobs that go along with it. We will legalize into the future your right to drive a gas or diesel-powered truck or car by repealing the Liberal EV mandate. That all of this will be in one bill. Next, we're going to reward those who build. We'll get rid of the capital gains tax when you reinvest your proceeds here in Canada. We need to reward investment by letting people who sell one asset and reinvest the money in Canada do so without capital gains tax. We will give free trade bonuses to the provinces, paying them the economic benefit that results from them opening their markets to fellow Canadians. Outside of the bill, we are making a call to action. Today, Conservatives are calling on Prime Minister Carney to have pipeline construction underway for at least 2 projects and to have at least one new natural gas liquefaction project and a road to the Ring of Fire in Ontario under construction by the first anniversary of him taking office.
Okay, so there's the overview of what the Conservatives are calling the Canadian Sovereignty Act, and we'll see what kind of reception that gets from the Carney Liberals once the House resumes. Now, clearly there is still going to be opposition to building a new pipeline project, and the challenge, whether it's for the government under Bill C-5 or under this Canadian Sovereignty Act, as the Conservatives envision it, is what do you do when you encounter obstacles and opposition? And that was a big factor in the delays and the cost increases when it came to TMX. Here's a little bit of what Pierre Poilievre had to say about overcoming those kinds of obstacles and opposition, including specifically some of the concern that's been raised by BC Premier David Eby about another major pipeline project going through BC.
Well, of course, nobody wants to build anything in Canada because the law makes it impossible. So that's why the Canadian Sovereignty Act will legalize building pipelines, producing energy, and putting it on ships. And when you do that, you will have pipeline construction like you do all around the world. Here in Canada, nothing gets done because Liberals ban things from getting done. We're proposing to legalize fast energy production, construction, and exportation. And that is why we need this bill. As for Mr. Eby opposing him, I, with the greatest respect, I have nothing against him personally. I think he's a nice guy. But one man can't block a project. British Columbians want a pipeline. Albertans want a pipeline. Canadians want a pipeline. We can't wait till everybody's on side. I mean, you know, there's some people out there who don't think Elvis is dead. We can't get everybody to agree on any basic fact, even the basic fact that we need a pipeline. So you're going to need national leadership, and yeah, that means that some people are going to protest, maybe chain themselves to a tree, but we have to push through that if we're ever going to get anything done.
A couple of the clips here from the Conservative leader on a couple of other issues, notably the situation between Canada and the U.S. and the uncertainty now we're facing with regard to getting a trade deal or what kind of tariffs we're going to face, and looking a little bit further ahead, what's going to happen when we go to renegotiate the CUSMA, the free trade deal between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre criticizing the government for building up expectations around getting a deal and so far not being able to deliver on that, and talking about how Canada needs to respond when it comes to counter tariffs.
The counter tariff should be, as I said, and I think Mr. Carney has copied my language on this, we need to narrowly target our counter tariffs at things that maximize the impact on the Americans while minimizing impact on Canadians, to put the pressure on our American counterparts to remove the tariffs so that we can restore a true free trading relationship with them once again.
Okay, and this last clip from Pierre Poilievre concerns the by-election he's facing coming up later this month, August 18th, in Battle River Crowfoot, a by-election that he hopes will get him back into the House of Commons, of course, after suffering the setback of losing his own seat in the general election earlier this year. I don't think there's a whole lot of drama regarding this by-election. This is certainly one of the safest conservative seats in Canada. But one element, I guess, of unpredictability that's been injected into this by-election has been the antics of what's known as the longest ballot committee. And in fact, that was a factor in Pierre Poilievre's race earlier this year. We saw it as well in some by-elections last year, where this group tries to pack the ballot with as many candidates as possible. They say they're trying to call attention to the issue of electoral reform, but just as these numbers have grown and grown, it's become, I think, more and more of an annoyance. It's prompted a conversation about how best to deal with all of this. Do we need a higher threshold when it comes to getting people's names on the ballot to maybe prevent this sort of thing? You still want people to be able to run as independents in an election. But what we're seeing now, and especially in this race, this by-election coming up, over 200 candidates, I mean, it's just gotten ridiculous. Now, the workaround that Elections Canada has come up with for this election, this by-election, is write-in ballot. So you're basically given a list of all of these candidates, but then you just have a small little ballot. You write in the name, as opposed to what would have otherwise been the case, a ballot with all of these names that would have been, I don't know, like a meter long or even longer potentially. So kind of unworkable. So this is one way to deal with that. And it's kind of a clever fix here by Elections Canada. I don't know if that's the answer to this problem. And I think there's some changes that could be made. But it's definitely been one of the big talking points in this by-election campaign. Here's what Pierre Poilievre had to say about that on Thursday.
Look, I didn't know a lot about this longest ballot thing when it was happening. I don't think it happened very much, but it happened some years ago in some other riding. But they've targeted me in 2 different ridings now. And the reality is I don't have a problem with anyone who wants to run for office, even if they're not known or not wealthy. They should be able to put their name on the ballot if they truly want to run. But that's not what these people are doing. They're adding their names even though they're not campaigning. They don't expect to win. They just want to inundate the ballot to confuse the situation, make it harder for people to vote, people with vision problems, the elderly, others who have difficulty now are going to have a harder time voting, and it shouldn't be allowed. The simple solution is just say that if you want to be a candidate, you have to get several hundred signatures of your own. You can't just use the same 100 or 200 signatures for all the candidates. And every candidate should have their own financial agent. If you did that, this interest group would not be able to pull off this stunt and this scam. And so that's why we're proposing to change the law to make sure that this longest ballot stunt never happens again.
All right, so there you go. That was Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre speaking in Calgary on Thursday. Back to the campaign trail for him facing this by-election coming up on August 18th. Just a moment, we're going to talk about the future of Canada Post, some renewed labor uncertainty at Canada Post as employees have rejected the latest offer from the company. But Canada Post, as a crown corporation, is facing some major financial challenges, losing significant amounts of money every single year, and I think in a lot of ways becoming a lot less relevant to most Canadians. So what needs to be done? There's a lot of different ideas out there on what to do with Canada Post. There's an interesting new report out this week from the Montreal Economic Institute laying out a path to privatization, privatizing Canada Post and following in the footsteps of other countries, Germany notably, that have privatized their post office and the best way to go about it. So we're going to delve into that coming up shortly. We'll hear from Vincent Geloso, who's a senior economist with the Montreal Economic Institute. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. Well, amid some renewed labor uncertainty at Canada Post, there's an interesting and timely new report out from the Montreal Economic Institute looking at what options Canada has, the federal government has, for actually reforming or maybe even fully privatizing Canada Post. You can read more at iedm.org. Joining us to talk more about it is one of the authors of this report, Vincent Geloso, a senior economist with the Montreal Economic Institute, assistant professor of economics as well at George Mason University. Vincent, great to have you with us here.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Rob, for I think the 10th time together that we're talking Canada Post. So it seems like you and I are dancing on this.
On and on this issue goes. But it does feel like it's coming to a head in one way or another. I mean, once we had the big labor dispute late last year, that was followed up by what was, I guess, called the Industrial Inquiry Commission to really take a deeper look at some of the problems Canada Post faces. And I think it's relevant to where we're at today because it's a pretty bleak picture of Canada Post, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think I went back to try and find my notes for what we were discussing the first time and what was the point when we were talking. I think it was close to a decade ago. Can't remember the exact date, but found my earlier notes. And it's a really good way of thinking about what's happening at Canada Post because the problems were on the horizon way back when. And when I looked at the data from way back when, it was clear there were inefficiencies at Canada Post, cost control issues that they were having, labor disputes were already there, and there was the overarching problem of the part of the market on which Canada Post has a monopoly, which is letter mail. Canada Post has been having difficulties generating the same revenues it used to because people are moving to different ways of communicating, of sending mails through mostly email, but also messenger packages that are far more effective than Canada Post and Purolator, which is owned by Canada Post to a high degree. So the core story you end up with is Canada Post was in the long, like this is a problem that was long in the horizon. There's no sign that this is going to resolve itself within the current framework.
And it's a weird situation it leaves us in because, like you say, I mean, letter volumes have declined precipitously. Canada Post is a lot less relevant to many or even most Canadians. Yet when it does go on strike, it causes such a huge disruption, especially for small business.
Yes, but I would point out that these disruptions are much smaller now, cost-wise for firms than they were before. So, for example, one of the things I did way back when was from all the strikes we could find from the 1970s onwards, each time there was one, we tried to find estimates that people made in the public of what were the costs of the strike to businesses. And it went from substantial daily costs relative to GDP. But today they're like a third of what they used to be in the 70s. So that means that even this ability of disrupting markets to get what the labor union wants or what management wants is no longer an option. So even there, it's telling you about the irrelevance of Canada Post. The new thing, however, in the portrait that I did not expect happening was while Canada Post has received a lot of indirect financial aid from the federal government, and they say we don't receive subsidies, but they do get special treatment. But now they actually get outright government monies, like straight up taxpayers injection, and that's new in the portrait. They got close to a bit more than $1 billion few years ago now. And the last time they got that before then was in the 1980s when it was converted from a government department to a crown corporation. So what it looks like now is Canada Post is going to keep doing the same thing it was doing. Is its inefficiencies will be shouldered either by consumers by making them pay more. But now, since consumers were like, no, we don't want to deal with you if you're that bad in terms of the service. Oh, now we're going to go see the government and get taxpayer funds out of this, which is different way of getting screwed.
And it's funny because there are those who want to preserve Canada Post in its current form, and one of the ideas is, well, let's expand into other businesses that can somehow supplement the postal business, like the idea of Canada Post being in banking. Like no one would propose the idea of a crown corporation in banking, but the idea that Canada Post should also do that and it can offset these losses. What do you make of that?
So I don't think it's a bad idea to diversify in other things, because if you look at DHL, and you're going to see that there's a link for why I'm using Deutsche Post. Deutsche Post went from a postal company to now a company that does logistical services, that does market studies for firm. They do multiple types of business-related services. So they don't just do mail. And But you know what's different about DHL relative to Canada Post? Is they're a private firm and they have to make a profit. So they have to figure out what works. Inside the incentives right now at Canada Post, as long as you have the availability of the taxpayer purse at your disposal, you have no incentive to control costs. You have no incentive to innovate. You have no incentive to try things out and abandon them if they don't work, or pick the one that actually works best. So it's not that they're wrong when they're saying maybe Canada Post would be good in banking. Maybe it would be good in logistical services. I don't know. But you know who would figure it out best? Consumers and businesses interacting together with the profit motive in mind. And that means that the way to discover whether or not that works is to privatize Canada Post and open up the market to competition. That's it. That's the only way we'll figure out if these claims are correct. It's not by saying, oh, Canada Post should do more things that government don't usually do.
So the report focuses on Germany, lessons from Germany and what Germany went through, as you alluded to, with its postal office. So do you see it as an apples to apples comparison? How similar are we to where Germany was at when they made these decisions?
I actually think so the usual reply we get is that Canada is not Germany. Germany is a really small country with lots of people. But if you think about it, Canada is actually a small country with lots of people. It's just that there's a lot of territory where no one lives. Right. Canadians are clustered around the border, and actually the way we're clustered along the border, the effective area in which Canadians live is quite much smaller than people think. That means the markets that actually need to be connected are not that far apart. There's also an upside. There are downside to density. So in Germany, one of the big costs for DHL is that they often are stuck in traffic. So the trucks have slower speeds, slower deliveries. So you don't do as much output per hour. You don't deliver as many letters, whereas Canadian cities are far more fluid than German cities. So in actual many ways, this cost structure in Canada should be in favor of Canada Post. So there's actually like a setting where we should actually be doing better than we are right now. And so the German case, the reason why it's cool is in the 1980s, they started opening up the competition. So there was no longer like a segmented part of the market that was the exclusive domain of the Crown Corporation. And at the same time, and a few years later, they started to privatize it. And the result was this cumulative reform is you see that the prices started falling. So letter prices today actually in Germany are 10% what they were, 10% below what they were in adjusted for inflation, what they were in 1989. Whereas in Canada, the adjusted for inflation, the price of stamp is 50% above what it used to be in 1989. So Germans, despite privatization, high cost of operation, the trend has been in their favor. So the prices have fallen and they've stabilized at a much lower level, whereas Canada Post just keeps increasing the prices. And now it's not just the prices that's increased, it's kind of the shadow price that we have to pay through higher taxes, because now Canada Post goes and asks the government for taxpayer monies. So the German example tells us, no, actually, we could do much better if we privatize and introduce competition.
Well, and much of industrial policy in this country is not geared toward consumers. Unfortunately, it's often about propping up industries or certain jobs. And I think the concern is that, and we see it with the latest rejection at Canada Post, is trying to protect what was once there, or what these jobs look like, what these jobs pay. Is it realistic to maintain that, or how different would the private side look?
So this is something that I don't like. That it's not that I don't think the question is good. It's a question that has a premise inside that says, government and politicians, and if I was a politician or a technocrat, I would know. I don't know. And you know what? Politicians in Ottawa also don't know. Markets are about figuring out through coordination through the price system. It's people try things out. If it makes money, you keep doing it. If it doesn't, you stop doing it. That system is a system of trial and errors. And no politician can figure that out very, very easily. And that means we also don't know what the proper practices are. So that's why when we are proposing at the MEI, when we're proposing our privatization approach, we're saying the best way to make sure that the privatization succeeds is to actually give shares to the employees. Yeah. So straight up, set up a block of shares, give them, not like sell them at a lower price, just give them to the employees. And that has two very large benefits. The first one is the employees now actually get a reward from controlling costs. So if they do things that are cheaper, they get a reward out of it because higher profits. And they also get incentives to innovate, and that means increasing productivity. So both ways it works, and that's what you would actually want to do. So as a way of making privatization succeed, and also like getting on board the staff at Canada Post, so it doesn't generate like in the transition a conflict of labor again, so it becomes like a disruptive privatization. We're saying buy in the members of Canada Post by giving them shares. Yes, it means that the government will generate fewer revenues from the privatization, but it increases the odds of a successful privatization and a successful, like an environment in which people try things out and will figure out what works best without having to have a one-size-fits-all solution that comes with the pretense of knowledge that is so common to politicians.
Is there any role still for government to play in ensuring, like what we have now, where the cost of sending a letter anywhere in the country is the same, or guarantees about a certain level of service? Does that still fit in a privatized model?
I think it can. The reason why is people tend to think that we need to make sure, like people in, say, Lac La Biche, Alberta, that they need to have a crown corporation to get mail. That's not true. We can actually have a like a private open market that's competitive, and people in very remote areas, we can have a specific policy that helps them, so that the vast majority of Canadians gain, but the few people who live in remote areas actually are compensated for that. And you know what? Actually, we already do that in Canada. It's called the Northern Residence Tax Deduction. So for people in certain remote areas, you're getting $5.50 per day of residence to $11 a day of residence in a remote area. Just either increase some areas that we'll define so that very remote people can still get compensation for this, and or bonify the amount to increase it to, say, rather than 550 to 11, do it 650 to 11 per day, or to 12 per day, something like this. Doesn't have to be the high cost policy of a crown corporation with a monopoly and all the bad incentives that come with this, the taxpayer liabilities, the higher prices for the vast majority of consumers. Just target those that we actually want to help. That is far better a policy than the one size fits all we're stuck now. So I'm not saying like throw away people from Lac La Biche. That's not the case. What we're saying is do targeted policies. They're far more efficient, far more cost effective, and the vast majority of Canadians in that case will get lower prices.
Yeah, I often, think of, because this comes up a lot, but you think of people in these communities and what else they need. Well, they need groceries, or they need gasoline. They need these other essentials that we don't leave to government. We don't leave to crown corporations. And when there are those unique circumstances, like, for example, people living in the remote north, there are ways of addressing some of those pressures. But can that apply in a similar way here, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's my point. I think we can't underestimate the ability of markets to find solutions, because customers in Lac La Biche are still customers. So if you let corporations charge prices, they might be able to try say, well, we still have clients over there. What if we try to have this? What if we try and mix different services so that the post office doesn't do just doesn't just do postages, it does, say, groceries as well. So it tries to piggyback multiple operations in that particular area, and it works better. And you know who does that? Amazon. Amazon has been the most efficient connector of people in remote regions across the world. Same thing with now a linkage with telecoms. Starlink does something highly similar in terms of the ability to reach customers in remote areas. We can't underestimate the power of market forces. So let's give as much room for market forces to work. And that's probably the best economic approach, is if you want to help certain people, then let the market work. And only after the market has worked, tax people just a little and then compensate people who actually do need the help. That's a far more effective policy than a heavy-handed, let's try and manipulate the market, create a semi-government monopoly with taxpayer funding, and then all these weird complications that just make a mess of everything. Let's just have market forces work and then help people once the game is run.
Mhm. It's interesting too, because, a few years ago, I remember there was such a big outcry about the idea of moving to super boxes as opposed to door-to-door delivery, or even the idea of moving away from daily delivery. But in a system like Germany's or other places where we do see privatization, is that something that can be like value added? If people really value
Yes.
everyday mail delivery, or, to their door, right? Door-to-door mail delivery, is that something that can be there as an add-on? That's something people can pay for if it's something they think they truly need.
So in Germany, there's more than a few hundred companies. I forget the exact number, but it's, I think, close to 500. Like, I'm citing it on the top of my head, but it's more than 500 companies. Anyways, hundreds of companies. And you know how they compete? They don't just compete on price. They compete also on the range of services. Some companies actually, like, I'm a customer that would fit one of the services. I don't need my mail 5 days a week coming in like regularly. I'm okay with actually going to a mailbox once a month and just having that there. I don't, honestly, I'm okay with that. Some people do not. So you know what companies are good at figuring out? How to reach every different type of customer and offering them a price for a customized service that they really like. And in Germany, that's what we've seen. If you were to allow market forces to work in mail in Canada and don't put like hurdles in their way, you would find not only that prices would fall, but you'd see different types of services emerge that sometimes don't exist right now, or that people value and don't get, or that people now have and don't really value. So, for example, I never valued the idea. So in Quebec, it used to be very long that it was at door delivery. So I'm originally from Quebec. This is why I'm using this as an example. Originally from Quebec, I was getting mail at my door, and I never really cared for that. If you said just go to a mailbox, say at like a inside a pharmacy, and you get your mail once, you pick it up when you want, once a month. Sure, I'd like that better. If it saves me money, I would probably do this.
Sure.
Some people, however, do want the mail delivered daily. Let people pick. Let people pick, and markets will find ways to create options for those who want to pick X over Y.
So the losses of Canada Post, I mean, we can't ignore that. And I've heard the idea floated, let's just end the legislative monopoly and let the chips fall where they may. But maybe that might exacerbate the problem we have, the financial losses at Canada Post. So does it have to go hand in hand with
Yeah, you have to do both of them.
or eventually, privatization?
Yeah, this is where maybe 10 years ago I would have said you can do half of it, which is what the Europeans did. The Europeans like forced the market to open, but then also said you don't have to privatize your postal operators. So some countries went that route, which is the case for Germany, but also the Netherlands, Austria, Britain went down that route. No longer a member of the European Union, but was when the directive was passed. But now in Canada, if you were to do this, you would just increase the liability for taxpayers. So now there's no way of doing half-hearted reforms. The best, now you have to do both. You have to privatize and liberalize. The question is how to do both of these things best. And the argument we're making is you can't crash course through this because there's risk. Privatization can go wrong. They have happened. People who are Eastern Europeans can tell you stories of privatization gone wrong. And this is known, for example, as asset stripping. Insiders know how the business work. They hoodwink politicians by buying stuff well below the stocks in the company, well below market value. And then they strip the company of the assets. And then you're left with a hollow shell that's worth nothing, even though it was worth something. So you don't want to have that problem of asset stripping. The problem is when you do that really fast, you increase the chances of asset stripping. But if you do it really slow, you increase the chances of interest group organizing and forming relationship with regulators and legislators that then structure the market in ways that privilege them. So you want to go fast, but you don't want to go too fast. So how do you kind of hit the sweet spot? The sweet spot is what we're talking about. The sweet spot is give in the first year 40% of shares to the employee of Canada Post. That will incentivize them to look over as shareholders so that you don't get the asset stripping problem. And you incentivize them to do cost control and to do productivity enhancement. You partially open up in the first year. In the second year, you sell the remaining shares. You give right of first regard to employees of Canada Post. If they want to buy first, then somebody else can go after. And at the same time, sell the rest of the company, open the rest of the market up, but you have to do them inside that 2-year windows, which is our privatization proposal.
Very interesting. Well, it certainly seems like the status quo is not sustainable. We'll see how the government eventually decides to deal with all of this. Much more is mentioned in this report. It's up at iedm.org. Vincent Geloso, thank you so much for the insight. Appreciate you joining us here.
It's a pleasure.
Once again, that is Vincent Geloso. He's a senior economist at the Montreal Economic Institute, assistant professor of economics at George Mason University. This latest analysis of where things are at with Canada Post and the case for privatizing it, you can read that at iedm.org. Listen, that's going to do it for this edition of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Also, make sure you check out the latest edition of The Line Alberta, alberta.readtheline.ca, getting a lot of reaction. A closer look at the Alberta separatist movement and speaking to someone who's on the inside of that movement, trying to understand why it is that so many Albertans are ready to split from the rest of Canada. I know it's a conversation that's going to be really dominating much of the discourse in Alberta in the weeks and months ahead. So check that out again, alberta.readtheline.ca. As mentioned, we'll be back with a new episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show coming up on Tuesday. More in the meantime at robbreakenridge.ca. You can find this podcast on your normal podcast platform, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and we've got our YouTube channel as well. You can see some of our video interviews there at Rob Breakenridge Show on YouTube. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend, folks, and we'll talk to you on Tuesday. Take care.